Hey, Stephanie.
Hey, Bo.
Hey guys.
Hey, Jimmy.
Some snack.
There we are. Okay.
Clearing out the room in about 7 minutes to start the next session.
Okay. So how are things in Oklahoma, Jimmy?
Very, very windy.
Good.
Just so you
How
guys
about
know,
Kentucky,
you're on a PA
Stephanie?
system.
Yeah.
Oh, we're on a PA system?
Yeah. So, okay.
All right, this is the 2-minute warning for the next presentation. So if you're gonna stay for nutrition, please come on over and have a seat. Thank you, Sam. Did you advance the slide? Thank you. All right. Dr. Nichols and Vandergrift, can you hear me and see me okay?
I can hear you just fine, Stephanie.
Fantastic.
Oh, there you
Thank
are. Now I
guys so
can
much
see
for
you.
joining us.
Okay.
All right, just one more minute. I've never done like a virtual and live people at the same time. It's kind of exciting.
Yeah, you could add it to your resume.
I see you stuck in a blast from the past picture of me there, Stephanie. So
What's that?
I said, I see you stuck a blast from the past picture of me in there. You must have got that from Kelly.
I pulled it from your Facebook page. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
All right, it is 3:30. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so welcome. Okay, welcome for those of you just joining us. I'm Stephanie Church. I am editor-in-chief at the Horse Media Group. We publish The Horse, Your Guide to Equine Healthcare, which is a monthly magazine, thehorse.com, also about horse health. And we publish the Retired Racehorse Project's Off Track Thoroughbred magazine. So I'm sure you've had that in your hands walking around here. We love that partnership with them. And as part of that partnership, we are running the seminars this afternoon. And this is the third and final seminar today. It's on feeding high energy horses. And both of our panelists are virtual in various parts of the country. And so today we're talking about nutrition. Designing off-track thoroughbred diets can be tricky because some need more body condition, but we don't want to fuel hyperactivity or hyperreactivity. So we have two PhD equine nutritionists with us today, Dr. Jyme Nichols and Dr. Bill Vandergrift, who are going to answer our questions about feeding high energy horses like our off-track thoroughbreds. But let's learn a little bit about them first. Dr. Nichols, can you tell us a little bit about your background as an equine nutritionist?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Stephanie. I really appreciate this opportunity. I am joining you all from Western Oklahoma today. So it's fun to see the use of technology and have all of us in different corners of the country still be able to come together and actually talk equine nutrition at the same time. So I'm really excited about today. I am an equine nutritionist for Stride Animal Health and Bluebonnet Feeds. I've been with them for 10 years and I am the director of nutrition for them. So I actually grew up with horses. I mean, horses have been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. In fact, I just don't feel like the world is quite right if I don't have a horse in my life. So I grew up competing. I went through college competing on horses. And, you know, one of the things that always intrigued me was nutrition. And so, you know, I went forward and I pursued nutrition through a master's degree and then through a PhD. And, you know, one of the things that kind of always, I guess, inspired me a little bit was this thought of how do we take the science and communicate it to the horse owner? And so during COVID, I actually started a podcast. And so I'm the creator of a podcast called Feed Room Chemist. And, you know, my whole point and purpose behind that is really to take the science and the research that we have on equine nutrition and try to apply it to the real world and try to communicate it to people in a way that is easy to comprehend, is easy to understand, you know, something that they can listen to an episode, and then turn around and say, hey, here's what I learned. They just did research on X, and here's what it does for horses, and here's how we can apply it. So I kind of just made it my mission to try to really educate the public, because I'll be the first to tell you that just because something makes sense on paper or in the lab does not always mean it's going to make sense in the real world. So I guess that's just kind of my passion right now, really, is not only equine nutrition and horses, but communicating that knowledge to the general public.
Thank you, Dr. Nichols. How about you, Dr. Vandergrift? What's your background with both nutrition and thoroughbreds, not just off-track thoroughbreds?
Okay. Well, thanks, Stephanie. I've been working with horses for well over 50 years, so I'll date myself a little bit there. Got my PhD in animal nutrition from Texas A&M back in 1980, and then actually taught horse production at the university level. I've been an equine nutritionist for a couple of feed companies, and then I started my own nutrition consulting business back in 1992. And since that time, I've really been blessed to work with some of the best horses and some of the best thoroughbreds around the world. And all from Japan to Australia, South Africa, Europe, and obviously in the US as well. And also, I used to be in the Lexington, Kentucky area. I'm now down in Georgia. But when I was in Kentucky, I actually had a breed to race operation myself, and I trained the horses personally. So used to race in the central US area, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, etc., Ohio. And so learned an awful lot about working with thoroughbreds and thoroughbred racehorses then. And also a lot of those that I worked with turned into off-track thoroughbreds, which then we retrained for other disciplines, or some of them became broodmares. So I've done a little bit of everything in all various disciplines with all different breeds. So taking these off-track thoroughbreds and retraining them for a new career, I'm quite familiar with it. So I'm excited to participate today. Okay.
Dr. Vandergrift was the chosen expert from our sponsor today, Triple Crown Nutrition, and we really thank Triple Crown Nutrition for that sponsorship. So appreciate you being here. Okay, so for those of you just joining us, we're excited to be back in person. Obviously, we have a bit of a virtual in-person thing going on here. We can take questions from both the live audience and the live audience here in person. We have this microphone that Julia is going to be the person to flag down for that. That way, the people who are virtual can hear you. Otherwise, that way our people who are our sources can hear you. We want our panelists to hear you. Anyhow, so let's see here. What else do we need to know? Oh, if you are virtual, please put your question into the text, into the Q&A on the text chat, and I will see that, and I will answer your question as soon as we have a chance. And you guys, Dr. Vandergrift and Dr. Nichols, if it looks like I'm looking down, it's because I'm looking at you. That's where it's supposed to. So I am making eye contact with you, believe it or not. All right, so we're going to cover a variety of categories today. They're going to be roughly like where to start, cool versus hot calories, helping the horse gain weight and top line, supporting the gut, and miscellaneous questions. So I try to keep us going in categories just so we're not jumping around a whole lot. But if something comes to mind as we're talking, please raise your hand. All right, so doctors, let's start with some context on how thoroughbreds were fed during their racing careers. Dr. Vandergrift, could you give us some insight on that?
Sure. As I think everybody's aware, racing is a very intense activity, requires a lot of calories per day. So as a result, a lot of thoroughbreds are fed or tend to be fed a heavy grain, high fat type grain concentrate. A good quality grass hay. A lot of them will either get alfalfa in addition or be fed a hay that's a mixture of grass and alfalfa. And there's as many different ways to feed racehorses as there are trainers, just to be honest about that. Some trainers prefer to use a commercial feed that's kind of considered a, when we say complete feed, I think people have different definitions of complete feed. So in this context, I think a lot of the racehorse trainers, when they say they're using a complete feed, means that it has all the mineral and vitamin fortification, as well as the protein, amino acid, and energy components to it. But then they'll also feed forage, in addition to that. Whereas other trainers may use a basic grain mix and decide to, use their own supplements for various reasons, and that gives them more flexibility, more versatility to address the individual needs of all the different horses that they might have in training. Because this is one thing, if you train thoroughbreds for any length of time, you realize this is not a cookie cutter operation, that what worked for one horse may not work for another. And so you have to have a certain amount of flexibility to put together a nutrition program that addresses the specific needs of those individual horses. And that really doesn't change once they retire off the track and then end up in the barn of somebody that's going to retrain them for another career. And well, that's part of what we're going to talk about today, is figuring out what are the special needs of that individual horse, and then, how do I address it? But, when we talk about a lot of sport horses and such, current time, we always, or not always, but lots of times will get involved in metabolic conditions such as insulin resistance and feeding horses to prevent insulin resistance. The reason I bring that up is I don't think there has ever been a thoroughbred racehorse that's actively racing that is tested positive for insulin resistance. Okay. The reason is they are so active, they are so fit, and even though they're fed a very high soluble carbohydrate diet, they're metabolizing all that, and they're not in danger of developing insulin resistance. Likewise, it's usually an issue of keeping enough weight on these horses rather than them becoming over-conditioned, which, don't want to sidetrack into a whole nother topic, but, that's a big reason why horses develop insulin resistance, is because they'll develop over-conditioned or too high a body condition score. So it's a high energy activity, and it requires a lot of energy to maintain them. And usually that high energy is going to come from a combination of grain and fat. And there's various ways to achieve that, but that's going to be the basic mode of how these racehorses are fed.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to start with just a question about where to start when feeding the spicy off the track thoroughbred, because I'm sure a few of us have spicy off the track thoroughbreds. Mm-hmm. Who would like to answer that question?
Yeah, I can go with that. I think that one thing, when you first get your thoroughbred home, I think we need to be careful that we don't try to change too many things too quickly with them. I think, as horse owners, we are eager to make these changes and make all of these, what we perceive to be improvements in the horse's diet and their life. But we have to remember that they are going through a huge change in their environment. They have lost, their friends, if you will. That's one thing that research says is just the simple act of taking a horse away from the horses they're familiar with is a major stress event. And so we've got that stress event, plus we have the stress event of moving to a new owner, a new barn, a new stall, a new program. Everything is just really coming down on this horse from a mental aspect. And so, a lot of times these horses might act, I love that you use the word spicy, they might act hot or excitable or spicy or however you want to talk about it. A lot of times they act that way first and foremost because they are uncomfortable, they're worried, they're anxious. It's more of a mental situation. And so I think it's important that we spend, the first week or 2 weeks really helping those horses adjust to that new environment from a mental standpoint, before we get into too much of a hurry to try to change their diet and change what we're feeding them and how we're handling them. So, I honestly like to start just by trying to keep their nutrition program as close to what it was before they got to me, and just allow that first, couple weeks to really just be a point where they can kind of settle down mentally. I can get to know them, they can get to know me, they can get to know the other horses on the property, and just our, kind of routine and way of life.
Okay, great. Thank you. And now a lot of the people who are here at the Makeover have horses that have been competing, so they've done some transitions before. Some might just be purchasing a new one, getting ready for next year. So are there any questions from the audience, both virtual and live, about that transition, the feeding right after you take one home? I'm sure that someone has probably thought this. What about supplements? Do they need to worry about supplements right away, or?
I'll go first and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Bill. It kind of depends on what supplements you're talking about. I always want to make sure we've got vitamins and minerals covered. As long as we have the what I call the basic nutrition, or the nutrition, meaning protein, your calories, your vitamins, your minerals, your amino acids, as long as those things are satisfied, I don't get too terribly excited about jumping into crazy supplements, with the exception of a little digestive support. So, a really good pre and probiotic is something that I will plug in any high stress situation. And so, as I just described, moving into a new environment is high stress. So probiotics are probably the only supplement that I will jump into almost regardless of what the horse is.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that, Dr. Nichols, if we step back just a second and look at the basic context in which we're discussing, off-track thoroughbred. So the first question is, why is this individual thoroughbred now an off-track thoroughbred? Okay, in other words, did he get retired, or he or she get retired because they didn't like racing and they couldn't run their way out of a wet paper bag? Or are they retired because they've had an injury? Or are they retired because they've been a real warrior and they've done their time, so to speak, at the racetrack, and now it's time to reward them and retire them and let them do something else? So depending upon what the circumstances are of why that horse is now an off-track thoroughbred rather than an on-track thoroughbred, that can help direct you towards any special needs of that horse, as I indicated earlier, figuring out what are the individual needs of this individual horse. Now, as we, I think it's been very well publicized over the years that most thoroughbred racehorses at some point in time or another are going to present with gastric ulcers. And in addition to that, we now, as more and more work is done in this area, we're also learning that many of them are also going to present with hind gut dysfunction, whether it's intestinal inflammation or dysbiosis or large intestine acidosis or whatever the case may be. But a large percentage of those horses coming off the racetrack are going to have some type of digestive dysfunction. And so I'm going to, support and second what Dr. Nichols just said about, digestive aids being one of the more obvious type supplements that you might want to add. Now, Triple Crown being the sponsor of this talk, a lot of their feeds have already got digestive aids built into the feed. But keep in mind that if, I've got a horse that's underweight, and he's hard to put weight on. He may in fact have intestinal inflammation or some type of dysbiosis. And that individual horse is probably going to require additional digestive aid supplementation above and beyond what you're going to find in any commercial feed, just to be blunt. And then, and talk about transitioning, if you happen to know what, so you now have an off-track thoroughbred that's standing in front of you. If you happen to know what that horse was actually fed at the track, you're ahead of the game, okay? But many of us, really won't know that. So when you say, well, I don't want to change much, well, since you don't know what the horse was fed, you don't know what you're changing or not. So what to do in that situation? What I always recommend in a case like that is to start with some type of feeding program that is very, what I call safe, quote unquote. And what I mean by that, we're going to be looking at a low soluble carbohydrate diet, high soluble fiber, high fat type feed. It might be a beet pulp based feed. Or a lot of the feeds that fall into that category tend to be beet pulp based, but they don't have to be. But the point being is, look for a low soluble carb feed that's high fat, that still has the calories, that's easily digestible. And you can start from there and then evaluate how your horse responds to that kind of diet, and then make modifications as you go forward. But again, if you know what the horse was being fed before you got it, that makes your life easier. Okay.
So we actually have a question from our online audience.
Great.
And Julia was ready. She got up to get the microphone. Online audience. Yes. And Jennifer is wondering, is there a way to find out what the horse has been fed before you get them? If you maybe, didn't get them directly from the trainer?
If you're lucky. Okay.
Yeah.
So you just ask a lot of questions, just to see how much people know about, where the horse came from and where it has been since the time it left the track. You can oftentimes, the horse's name. You can look in the jockey club and find the trainer of record. And so you can track down the trainer and ask, and if you can locate them and, shoot them, contact them and say, what's your feeding program like? Because I've got one of your horses and I want to continue on. But keep in mind, depending upon how much time has transpired since that horse left the track, chances are that horse has already been through several transitions and you may not know all of them. So. Okay.
And I got my horse after 90 days of restarting, and he was on a complete feed. And I think it was the same one he had been on, but it was interesting to take that knowledge and start transitioning him to what I wanted him to eat here in Central Kentucky.
Yep.
Okay. Do we have any live questions? Yes, we have one over there.
Yeah, so would you have any different recommendations for horses that were transitioning immediately off the track or with a very little restart time versus horses who had significant layups or recovery from injury, had significant time off, like 6 months to a year, something like that? Are there different recommendations to start for those horses?
Could you guys hear that okay?
I could, yes. Well, if you're going to transition one right away, that implies that the horse is sound. Okay, so I'm going to, start there. So if the horse is functionally sound and you're able to continue on, with the horse, it's just a matter now of teaching them new tricks, no pun intended, for their new career, then it's just, you can transition the feeding program, as Stephanie mentioned, to what you would like it to be. And you would simply use the usual transitioning methods in order to do that. And if you're getting it right off the track, your chances of knowing how much the horse was fed and what it was fed improve. So if you have that information, that gives you an idea of, how much grain the horse was being fed on a daily basis, what the forage was like, how much forage the horse was consuming. And so you can kind of continue along those lines. A horse that's been laid up, let's say it had a tendon injury, okay, just for discussion purposes. So you're looking at an extended recovery time. Oftentimes we're talking months. And so it's a lot of downtime for that horse. So his diet will have changed because he's no longer in training. He's getting a lot of stall rest and so forth, and goes into physical therapy. So everything's going to be adjusted down, so to speak. And so now we're not really transitioning an off-track horse per se. Now we're simply transitioning a horse coming off of a layup. And it really doesn't matter if that's a thoroughbred or a quarter horse or a warm blood. If you're coming off an injury, that is done more slowly and more gradually. And so that obviously is going to affect your feeding program. But in both cases, if the horse has an injury, as Dr. Nichols was talking about, that's a stress factor. And anytime you've got a stress factor, you've got increased, systemic inflammation. And horses express stress. One of the main places they express stress is in their digestive tract. So a lot of these horses are going to present with digestive dysfunction, whether they're right off the track or whether they've been laid up for several months. So that's a common denominator between the two that needs to be addressed. Okay. All right.
Okay. We got a question over here on the side of the room. Thank you for being the runner, Julia.
Oh, no.
So how do you feel about the non-soy position that seems to be coming up a lot, and also the adding flax as a very good ingredient? Those are two ingredients, like soy and flax. I just want to know what your opinions about those two ingredients are.
Dr. Nichols,
start
you
with
want to
that
jump
one.
in on that? Yep.
Yeah. Flax is a really good calorie source. It's also a really good omega-3 fatty acid source. And one of the things, omega-3s, that's a very kind of buzzworthy topic. People, I think, are sometimes misled. There are actually a lot of different types of omega-3s. So, it's not like there's just an omega-3 isn't one thing. What it is it's a certain fatty acid chain, and there are multiple types of them. Now, there are two that we are generally most concerned with when it comes to horse nutrition. Those are called EPA and DHA. The reason that we care so much about those is that they are what we call essential fatty acids, meaning the body can't produce those on their own, so a horse has to get those from the diet. Now, the most concentrated sources of EPA and DHA come from marine sources. So think of fish oil. That's generally where we would lean for the best sources of omega-3s. Now, where flaxseed comes into play, it also contains omega-3s, but it's a different chain called ALA. Now, the difference in ALA is the body actually has to convert the ALA into EPA and DHA. And one of the challenges in that process is that the body is not real efficient at making that conversion. So it kind of depends on the research that you read, but I generally use 10% as a rule of thumb for the amount that can be converted, the amount of ALA that can actually get converted into that final EPA and DHA form. So You know, flaxseed, just the fact that it is so high fat in and of itself is going to have a lot of benefit for that horse from a calorie standpoint, from a fat standpoint, if you will. So when we talk fats, those are sources of what we call cool energy calories. That means it's going to put a lot of calories into that horse, or energy into that horse. Let me stop myself just a second. So the word energy can be confusing because from a nutritionist perspective, when we say energy, what we really mean is calories. But when a horse owner is talking about energy, what we mean from the horse owner standpoint is that spicy or hot or excitable attitude, right? So flaxseed does not make your horse spicy or hot or excitable. It has those cool energy calories, that high fat, and those calories are going to help put body condition onto your horse. They're going to help make a really nice shiny coat. All of those things are going to be really, really beneficial for your horse. So I really like to see flaxseed as one of the ingredients in horse feeds for sure.
Horses aren't aquatic, so why would they be using fish oil? I mean, you know, they never would have gotten that in their natural diet.
Yeah, I people ask that a lot actually. And like I said, EPA and DHA are those specific omega-3s that are actually essential in the diet. So in, let's say, you know, a horse in the wild would be getting those through vegetable sources. Those vegetable sources, so flax is a plant, right? So we would call that a vegetable source of omega-3s. And the vegetable sources are high in the ALA. So the body then is having to make that conversion into EPA and DHA because that's ultimately what you're wanting. So the modern world, we have now the technologies and the knowledge and the ability to go straight to the source of the EPA and DHA. So it's, we kind of are trying to cut corners and bypass that horse having to make all of those conversions on their own and try to feed them that finished essential fatty acid, which is the EPA and DHA. And so fish oil just happens to be one of the most concentrated sources of that. And so that's why we tend to go there.
Yeah. And Dr. Nichols, let me add, because I'm agreeing with everything that you're saying, but I just had a thought that hopefully might add some clarity to it. A horse in this quote unquote natural environment is going to obtain the alpha linoleic acid, the ALA, as well as EPA and DHA from fresh forage, pasture grass, okay? Or as Dr. Nichols indicated, you know, vegetative sources. But now, see, that immediately introduces an issue if you've got a racehorse, because racehorses do not get access to pasture. And when we take fresh grass and we dry it and we make hay, those omega-3s essentially go poof, okay? So unless you've got a source, an alternative source of ALA, EPA, DHA in that horse's diet that does not have access to fresh green forage, then they're going to be short on that. Now, in relation to a high performance horse, any high performance horse is going to present with a certain degree of systemic inflammation, okay? Any athlete, okay? Whether it's equine, human, canine, you name it, okay? And this is where the omega-3s shine, no pun intended there either, because they are some of your primary anti-inflammatory nutrients, okay, that you can put into the diet. So again, going back to our thoroughbred racehorse in training, if they're not being supplemented or if they don't have a source of these omega-3s in their diet, then their level of systemic inflammation is going to slowly creep higher and higher and higher, and that's going to just wreak havoc. And then you will end up with a spicy thoroughbred, you know, due to that extra inflammation. Okay. And so now stepping forward, okay, so if we have to supplement these omega-3s, what do we use? And as Dr. Nichols indicated, fish oil in terms of the level of EPA and DHA, you know, is your best choice. There are some alternative sources that are being worked on currently, but right now, when you look at the cost of those alternative sources, mainly algae sources or other vegetative sources, when you look at how much they cost versus fish oil type products, it's kind of hard to make that substitution. But admittedly, though, for certain individual horses, the palatability of fish oil supplements can be a challenge. And, 9 out of 10 horses, will consume them. But if you're like me, you'll have that 10th one. Okay. And so then, you've got to find a way to, entice that horse to consume it or find an alternative source. And so let's say, for example, there's several fish oil supplements out there. And let's say you've got one of those horses that goes, this ain't happening. I'm not eating that. Then flax, even though it's not quite as effective, that's probably your next best choice. So it is something that we do recommend on a regular basis. So I hope that kind of clears that up a little bit. Okay.
I think we've all seen the horse that's turned its nose up at fish oil. It'd be pretty dramatic sometimes. Mine did it a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
All right. I do have
I think Christy had a follow-up question about soy.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
what were your feelings about soy, and why are some feeds not having it anymore in there, and others using it as a source of fat?
Yeah. You want to tackle that, or you want me to, Dr. Nichols? I'm happy to.
Paraphrase.
Go ahead, Dr. Bill. You take the lead on that one, and then I'll bring up the tail end.
Okay. To start, there's been quite a bit of research done with soy protein for all different species of animals, including horses. Soy is an excellent source of amino acids, and specifically the amino acids that help topline, which is something that another subject that everybody seems to be interested in at the present time. So from a nutrient content standpoint, soy protein is a great choice to incorporate into the diet. Now, you mentioned fat. There's a difference between whole soy and soybean meal. Okay, so a whole soybean contains, I'm just, relatively speaking, somewhere around 17-18% fat. So that's fairly high fat level. And then, but you can go to the grocery store and buy soybean oil and put that on your salad or use it in your cooking or whatever. Well, where's that oil come from? Obviously, that comes from the soy. So the whole soy that then has the oil taken out of it, what's left is then the soybean meal. And that's the highly concentrated protein source. So both of those sources you can find in equine diets. Now, raw soy does have some anti-nutritive components to it. And I have read articles, I've seen a lot on the internet where they talk about, all of these anti-digestive enzymes and all these anti-nutritive factors, and therefore soy is bad and you shouldn't feed soy or shouldn't eat soy from a human standpoint. What they failed to mention is that the soybean meal that's incorporated into an animal diet has been cooked just the same way you cook your food before you eat it. And that cooking or takes away, denatures all those anti-nutritive factors. So from my side of the fence, that's a non-topic. I don't even worry about that. Okay. Now, the other area where soy can sometimes get a bad rap are with the estrogenic compounds that you find in soy. It's a GMO crop. In other words, it's treated with glyphosate, et cetera. So people, sometimes give it a negative connotation on those terms. Now, as I mentioned, there's been lots and lots of research done on soy with horses. Soy has been fed to horses since any of us were born. Let's just put it that way. And I have a right to say that. Okay. So, and we don't have any two-headed horses out there, or we don't have any dead horses because they consume soy. Okay. Soy is a safe ingredient to feed. So is an alfalfa. Now, why did I just throw that one into the mix? Okay. You hear some of the same comments about alfalfa, because alfalfa also has some estrogenic compounds. Alfalfa can also make some horses, I'm going to use Stephanie's term, spicy. Okay. And I have actually been involved in discussion groups with other equine nutritionists, and we talk about this. You know, does soybean meal or does alfalfa make a horse hot? And again, if you look at the research, you know, the answer is no. But, you know, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you, I had a quarter horse stallion that if you fed him any amount of alfalfa, he got as spicy as anybody would want him to be. Okay. But if you didn't feed him alfalfa, he was easiest horse in the world to get along with. So again, like I said, you know, 9 out of 10 horses, I'm going to have that 10th one. And I think the same thing holds true for soy, that the vast majority of horses that, you know, are fed a feed with soybean meal in it, they get along just fine, no problems. But there are some horses out there that will be a little bit sensitive to some of those estrogenic compounds and so forth that are found in the soy, and particularly mares. You know, they'll get spicy, so to speak, if they're on a diet with soy. So, okay, you've got that one individual horse, but you know, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, there's an individual one then that you might have to do something a little bit different. That doesn't mean soy is bad, but what it means is it didn't mix with that particular individual horse. By the same token, I've also worked with horses that have had digestive dysfunction and presented along the lines of fecal water syndrome, for example. They might have a mild colic, you know, nothing serious, you know, a little bit of Banamine, you know, takes care of it, but it would be reoccurring. And when they took those horses off of, or let me say, rather than say take them off, a better way to put it is when they put them on a GMO-free diet, all those symptoms disappeared. Okay. So for that individual horse, we're talking about one that's sensitive to some of these GMO products. The same thing holds true for people. I bet the vast majority of us tuning in to this presentation can consume GMO produced products without any problem. But if you're the one that can't, then it's very important to you. And, you know, and we get that. But so for the most part, soy is, you know, no problem, but there are some individual horses that are sensitive to it. There are individual horses that are sensitive to beet pulp. Okay, so, and the reason I mentioned that is earlier I said, you know, put them on a beet pulp based feed, but keep in mind, I think there's no data to back up what I'm going to say. I'm literally, I'm grabbing this number out of the air, but I'm grabbing it out of the air based on, you know, the thousands and thousands of horses that I've worked with over the years. I'd say it's probably one in about 8,000 to 10,000 horses that are going to be sensitive to beet pulp. But when you run into that one, you know it, because they're either sensitive to it or they're not. There's very few in between. And so, you know, the point being is that different horses, different DNA makeup, they can have different sensitivities to different foods, just like people can. But so you modify what you're doing with those horses based on that individual reaction. Okay.
Great, thank you. We have a somewhat related question from the online audience from Kathleen, and she was curious about systemic inflammation. Is there a way we can measure that or know that it's there?
Okay. I'll throw one in there. There are some markers. Well, let me first of all say this way: there's no easy, cheap way to measure it. Okay, so, but you can pull joint fluid, for example, and look at prostaglandin levels in the synovial fluid and things of this sort, and get an idea of how much inflammation you've got in the joints. That is an indication of how much systemic inflammation you've got. But that's an invasive thing, putting a needle into a joint and then analyzing, those inflammatory compounds is not cheap, and it's not normally done on a clinical basis. So in the real world, how do you know? A horse that has higher levels of systemic inflammation is going to be one of those horses that is very difficult to put weight on. They're going to be a little bit hyperreactive. Lots of times that systemic inflammation, at least in part, is going to manifest itself in the digestive tract. And the digestive tract of the horse contains 70% plus or minus of that horse's immune system. And here's an important point, and that is that the horse's intestine produces more serotonin than the horse's brain. Okay. And there is, that gut-brain axis that is very tightly bound in the horse. And if they have a lot of systemic inflammation and the digestive tract is involved, they don't produce a lot of serotonin in the gut. And as you know, horses survive, that fight-flight reaction. Well, serotonin is one of those hormones that kind of keeps them level and low-keyed. So without enough serotonin, the way I explain it is they get stuck in the flight mode, okay, if you can think of it that way. So little things like, okay, today that feed or that water bucket was on the left side of the barn. Today it's on the right side of the barn. Oh my God, it must be a monster that's going to bite me. Getting that overreaction can be related to that. So these are some of the things that you deal with when you have a horse with systemic inflammation, whether it's throughout the body or concentrated in the gut. Either way, those are some of the reactions or telltale signs that you get. Okay.
Yeah, and another thing that I'll do is just look at the diet in general. So there's a lot that we can pull out of human research and kind of, generally apply to horses. So I think that, most people are pretty comfortable with the concept that, if you eat a diet that's high in sugar, there's going to be a lot more inflammation within your body. So, that's one thing I'll do with a horse is, look at that overall diet. Dr. Bill used the term, soluble carbohydrates. So think about like NSC, so non-structural carbohydrates. So that's your starches and your sugars that are in the diet. If you have a diet that's really high in those NSCs, that's a lot of starch, a lot of sugar, right, that's circulating in that horse's system. That's going to predispose them to have more inflammation throughout their body. Also, we had talked earlier about how important omega-3s are for keeping inflammation down. And the fact that simply being on a hay-only diet for a forage source essentially eliminates the chance that that horse can consume those anti-inflammatory omega-3s. So if I have a horse that is on, a high NSC grain, and then is on a hay-only diet, okay, those are two factors that are going to flag me to say, hey, there's a good chance that that horse is probably going to be dealing with a little bit more systemic inflammation than a horse that was on, say, turned out on the pasture and on a low starch, low sugar diet.
And it's actually a bit of a double whammy here too, because as we talked about earlier, your omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, but if you reach a certain level of systemic inflammation throughout the body, then the conversion of ALA to EPA goes down. And also your requirement for EPA and DHA go up. So your conversion's down, your requirement is up, bingo, you've got basically a deficiency of your anti-inflammatory omega-3s, which is another reason why we like to supplement those in the diet. Okay.
Thank you. I'm so glad that there are people like you who know all these things and can explain them to us.
There's a lot of moving
Very
parts.
complicated. Yes.
Yes.
We have a question from our live audience in person.
Hi. So you talked about horses that have had some time off since being off the track and how their diet changes a little bit within that time frame. The horse that we were competing with is one that came from a kill pen. So she, when we adopted her, she was very emaciated, you know, really, really ribby, barely had anything on her, and is a really hard keeper. And how would you go about something in that sense?
Okay.
Yeah,
You want to
so
start, Jimmy? Yep, go
yeah,
ahead.
I'll start with that one. So one thing, you know, if you guys do run into a situation like that where you have a horse that is severely emaciated and clearly call it a starved horse, right? You want to be really careful about how you reintroduce feed to them. You know, I think our tendency when we see a horse that is clearly starved and malnourished, you know, our tendency is give them all the hay they want, give them all of the grain, the most that we can give them, feed it to them. And that can actually be a little bit dangerous. So you want to, I generally will tell people to start with grass hays rather than alfalfas when we're starting to reintroduce. And the reason for that is because the quality of that, so a little bit lower calories, a little bit lower protein, just the nutrition in general is a little bit lower, and you've got a little bit higher fiber content, and start real slow. Don't start with the grain. You want to make sure that they're on that forage first for a good period of time, maybe 10 to 14 days. Make sure they're really eating well. You know, one of the most important things you can do is have their teeth examined. You know, sometimes horses lose weight and look undernourished for reasons other than not being fed. Okay, it may be that horse's teeth are in such poor, terrible condition that they physically cannot chew and break down the feed and the forage that's been given to them. So I always start with the teeth. You know, the teeth are really kind of the first part of the digestive tract. I think a lot of people skip that, and it can really make a profound difference in how a horse responds to the nutrition that you do give. So get teeth done. Make sure you work with your veterinarian. Make sure you've got a proper deworming protocol and all of that in place, and then go to your nutrition. So start with hay first. Make sure they're eating that hay well before you start to introduce grain or feed. When it does come time to introduce grain or feed, I like to start with higher fiber. Like Dr. Vandergrift mentioned, you know, we've talked about beet pulp. So I like beet pulp based feeds. That's a very easily digestible, easily fermentable fiber that provides a lot of extra benefit to the microbial populations that live within the gut. I try to stay away from your high starch, high sugar ingredients. There's actually something called refeeding syndrome, that if you were to get a horse in and if you were to put a large amount of starch, high NSC, high starch and high sugar type of a grain to that horse, it can really cause a lot of issues and problems because of that high sugar load. So again, start with your forage, start with your hays, and then when you introduce grain, make sure you go with something that's higher fiber, easy to digest, and get those calories from fat sources rather than those starches and those sugars.
And I'd also add to that, since we're specifically addressing a horse that's emaciated and coming out of a kill pen, and as I'm sure everybody in attendance is aware of some of the outstanding racehorses that have actually been found in kill pens, it just blows my mind. But so they do get rescued. And so hats off to those of you that are doing rescuing those horses. But a horse that's emaciated to that point, he's got dysbiosis. In other words, his microbiome has been blown out the window. You know, that's a real scientific term, but it explains exactly what's happened. And, you know, I used to think that, you know, whether it was, you know, due to a horse running a fever or heavy antibiotic use, or in this case, an emaciated horse, if we put the horse on a good diet, in other words, you know, good forage, good quality forage, and as Dr. Nichols said, you know, we took care of its teeth, et cetera, that microbiome would reestablish itself and everything would be good to go. Well, research as well as clinical evidence has indicated that that's not the case. That microbiome will not rebuild itself spontaneously in many cases. So here is a perfect scenario of where we have to introduce probiotics and prebiotics. And now we're hearing terms such as postbiotics, but that's a topic for another day, folks. I mean, we can really get into that. But the point being, I will say this, you know, we hear a lot about probiotics. Keep in mind, a probiotic has to be a live bacteria that can survive in some type of medium outside the horse, okay? The majority of the horse's microbiome is anaerobic. In other words, it cannot survive in the presence of oxygen, which excludes many of those from being made into probiotics. But most of your real beneficial bugs in your horse's microbiome are the anaerobic bacteria. So how do you get them to come back? How do you help them proliferate? And the answer is with prebiotics. And prebiotics tend to be specialized carbohydrates, you know, mannan oligosaccharides, fructan oligosaccharides. You'll hear the term MOS, M-O-S, or FOS, F-O-S, inulin. In fact, wheat bran has got a certain degree of prebiotic in it, which helps explain why in years past, wheat bran used to be a fairly popular thing to feed the horses. But the point being is you need to put something in that diet that is going to help support the regrowth and rebalance of that microbiome in order to slowly and eventually get that horse back to where you want them to be. Okay.
I talked about this topic when we were preparing for this with Dr. Nichols and Dr. Vandergrift. My horse actually had surgery for a chip that he got out in the pasture, not during his 6 years of racing. And afterward, his personality changed a lot. He got very like spooky in the cross ties, and he'd start seeing goblins, and he just didn't seem right. And it wasn't until I took a look at his hindgut and I took him off all the sugar. He was on a concentrate, and I put him on a balancer, and I put him on a lot of forage, that it all cleared right up. He was pretty crazy. So you might consider something like that. Consider how much sugar is in the diet, right, guys? So, okay, I have several questions here about top line. How do we put top line on a horse without causing other things, making them any hotter, etc.?
You want me to?
Yeah, so I'll
ahead.
start there.
Mhm.
Yeah. You know, so one thing that I think has gotten a lot of attention over the last few years is the use of amino acids and making sure that those amino acid profiles are well balanced, not included in the diet and well balanced. And so I think that's a really good place to start. But what we're seeing is that doesn't help all horses. And you know, there's actually a direct connection that we have found, is that, you know, back to this whole topic of the microbiome and the hind gut, when the horse's digestive tract is out of balance or the horse is suffering from dysbiosis, it really impacts a variety of different areas within the body. And one of those areas happens to be top line. just the horse's ability to turn nutrition into that cover, or to convert. So the hind gut, the microbes there produce what are called volatile fatty acids, or VFAs. And when the microbes are functioning properly, they're creating these VFAs, and that's what the horse then uses for energy within the body. When those microbes go into disarray, or if we get shifts in the populations that are inappropriate, so we've got higher levels of the bad bacteria and lower levels of the good bacteria, those are things that are happening internally that have a dramatic impact on that horse's body condition. And top line is just one of the places where it's first to go. So what I generally, if I'm dealing with someone who says, I really want to work on the top line of this horse, there's kind of three things that I look at. First, I want to make sure that we've got adequate protein and amino acids in the diet. Secondly, I want to make sure that we've got some extra fat in the diet, so those cool energy calories that we keep referring to. But then thirdly, I want to make sure that we are really focusing on getting the health of that horse's hind gut in a proper place, or in an appropriate place.
And
anything
I
to
guess
add,
I'd like to add to that. I guess this is where I kind of have to kind of confess, so to speak. In addition to being a nutritionist, I do a lot of podiatry work. And as a farrier podiatrist, somebody that works on the feet, and all you farriers out there, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. You train yourself to look at the whole horse. Okay. So if you've got a horse with a weak top line, or some type of lameness issue, or he's got an issue with the way of going, you don't just pick up the foot and slap a shoe on there. Okay. You have to take a look at the horse's conformation, look at his way of going, look at his overall body, see how all the different parts work together. And then if you can help the horse out, make an adjustment there. Why do I mention that? With thoroughbreds, it is common for them to have what we call a negative plantar angle. In other words, in the hind feet, the angle of the coffin bone, instead of it being 0 degrees or slightly positive, can actually be negative. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this or not, but the coffin bone will actually be sitting like this inside the hoof capsule. Well, what that does is it pulls on that deep digital flexor tendon, just like a guitar string or a piano wire, and just tightens it up. And that connects to the gluteal muscles and goes all the way up into the back. And a lot of these horses will be real tight and real sore in the hip, and they'll be tight and sore in the back. And if they're tight and sore in the back, they ain't going to have a good top line. Okay. So that's where this was leading to. Okay. So, and this is a case where, as Dr. Nichols said, you could feed that horse all the amino acids that he could handle, but as long as he's tight and he's sore, he's not going to develop a good top line. So I make a big issue out of stepping back and looking at the whole horse and try to figure, okay, what's the primary issues here, and how can we correct them, and can we correct them? I know there was one of the previous seminars, I think they talked about kissing spine. Okay, if you got a horse that's presenting with kissing spine, chances are he ain't going to have a good top line. Okay, so no matter what you feed him. So you've got to incorporate all of these other things that might be going on. What if he's subluxated in the withers, for example? What if he's subluxated in the SI joint? What if he's out in the pole? Okay. All of these things, in turn or additive, are going to decrease that horse's ability to develop a good top line. So I would encourage you to, if you don't know how to evaluate that on your own, incorporate the help of other people that can, because you might be amazed at some of the things that you find with your individual horse that are actually, easily fixable. And boy, what a difference, it can make in your horse's way of going, in your horse's comfort. But
Well,
one last thing, and one of the accounts that I've worked with over the years is a big farm in Japan where they've got 3,000 brood mares. It's one of the largest thoroughbred operations in the world, literally. And they're breed to race. So you get to see the mare when she's bred, you get to see the foal, and you follow the foal all the way through, and you see how they do at the racetrack. So it was a great laboratory for me. I learned a lot more from them than they ever learned from me. I admit that right up front. But what I was going to share with you is they had a genetic line in their brood mares that genetically the great-grandmother, the grandmother, the mother, and all the babies, and right on down the line, every single one of them had a weak top line, and it didn't matter what you did. They were just going to have a weak top line. So when you see it like that through generations and through that family, that's an indication you're dealing with a genetic issue. And so that comes into play also. Okay.
No, that was exactly the point I didn't want to let escape is that genetics definitely plays a role, and age too, so the ligaments can start to stretch and sag as horses age. And so, being able to kind of visually determine whether the top line is poor because of genetics or the physical structure of the horse or age, or there's just a lot that goes into it. It's not as simple as just feed more amino acids. There's just a whole big picture you have to take into account.
Yep. Okay.
So I've got a question for you from our online audience, and Cynthia is wondering, what should you feed and how much should you feed a horse that is on extended stall rest to keep them sane, as well as provide enough nutrition to assist the healing of the injury?
Yeah, so I think it's important so there's this Bible, this resource that we as nutritionists use, and it's called the NRC, which is the nutrient requirement. It's the nutrient requirements of horses, and it's published by the National Research Council, so NRC. And when you've got a horse on stall rest, it's important that you pay attention to the fact that you're not overfeeding, especially when it comes to the energy or the calories, along with the proteins. So I try to go back to essentially maintenance status. So that's the category that NRC says this is the basic nutrition that a horse needs in order to maintain normal metabolic processes, sustain life, not go into a deficient state. So we want to be at or just a little above that maintenance status that NRC has published, which generally means you have to take away a lot of the grain. If let's say that horse was on a decent amount of alfalfa, you're probably going to have to take that away. You're probably going to have to go to more of a hay diet or grass hay diet. But it's really important that when a horse is trying to heal and recover from an injury, that you don't take away the critical healing nutrients. So things like the amino acid profiles, the trace minerals. I think trace minerals are so overlooked in horse nutrition. So things like copper, zinc, manganese, their forms are very important. So I really like to use organic forms of those trace minerals. All of that is going to go into helping that horse heal its body. I then like to kind of take it a step further and look at, are there ways that we can increase blood flow or oxygen supply to injury sites? Are there things that can help reduce inflammation that horse might be dealing with on a systemic level? So there are individual supplements that I will look at incorporating into a horse's diet, depending on the type of injury they have and how much time they're actually going to be on that stall rest.
I think some other guidelines also, in addition to what do you feed, keep in mind that different people use different terms, like I think, the term complete feed has been used a couple of times this afternoon, but in other words, for example, in the Triple Crown line, they have a product called Triple Crown Senior. Okay. Provides a lot of protein, energy. The blue bonnet line, but Omega Force, be another one. It's, high energy type feed. Those type of products, I actually call a supplement. Okay. People say, no, that's a feed. Well, no, it's a supplement. So what do you mean by that? Horse feed is forage. Okay. Horse feed is pasture grass and it's hay. And anything in addition to that, you're supplementing what the horse can't get from the forage. Horses are constant grazers. That's what they're supposed to consume. So a racehorse, that's actively racing, you cannot meet his energy requirement on grass alone. So we supplement his hay with a high energy feed to get enough calories. Okay, now we're going the opposite direction. Now we've got a horse that's in layup. He's in the stall. So his energy expenditure is very, very low. We're simply trying to maintain his body weight. So chances are, not always, but chances are pretty good that you'll actually be able to keep that horse in a desired body condition on just hay. Okay. But as Dr. Nichols pointed out, and I jump up on the rooftops and scream this, don't forget the minerals. Okay. They are so important for normal health and doubly important for repair. And if you got a horse that's in layup, he's trying to repair something. So he's going to need those minerals. So some type of mineral supplement, a balancer type product plus the hay. If that doesn't provide enough calories, then by all means, okay, then, add a feed to that. But again, here's a rule of thumb for you. Most feeds out there, and it doesn't matter who makes them, your standard type feed product, you have to be feeding somewhere around 5 to 6 pounds a day before you meet the mineral vitamin requirement for that horse. So if you got a horse in layup, maybe you're only feeding them a pound or two of a feed, and you may be feeding them that much just to facilitate some of the supplements or some of the medications that you're giving that horse orally, but you're not meeting the mineral requirement at that level. So you've got to add in some type of product that's also going to provide those essential and very critical minerals. Another guideline for you, some horses will actually get too fat if they're in the stall on nothing but hay. So people then try, I need to restrict the hay so my horse doesn't get overweight. How much can you restrict it and stay out of trouble? There's a couple of ways of looking at that, but from a practical standpoint, another rule of thumb for you. You don't want your horse to go without anything to eat, or shall we say, you don't want your horse to go without hay for any more than 6 hours. Okay. Preferably not quite that long, but once that horse has an empty stomach, so to speak, for more than 6 hours, your predisposition for the development of gastric ulcers goes boom. And so now you've got another issue, and that's actually a man-made issue when that happens, and you don't want to get involved in that with your horse. So keep the hay in front of them, use a slow feeder if you have to. But what you don't want to do is, if you feed your horse, say 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and then you're not out there till 6 o'clock in the morning, whenever your schedule is. But the point is, so you get out there in the morning and all of his hay is gone. Okay. Well, how long has he been without hay? Okay. You may not know the answer to that. If it's been more than 6 hours, you're setting him up for gastric ulcer development. So just, try to keep that, work that into your schedule and keep that in the back of your mind when you're managing these horses. Okay.
Thank you. So we have a question from a member of our online live audience, and it's Kate. And she's asking, can you explain about where you get fats and proteins in an equine diet? I only think about fats in a supplemental oil, but are they also in grains? And do you get fats and proteins in forage? I know we've talked a lot about fats, but we haven't brought the proteins in there very much.
Okay. Dr. Nichols, you want to run with that?
Yes, absolutely. So the biggest source of protein in the horse's diet is going to be the forage. I am a really big proponent of testing forage. So I tell people, just as a general rule of thumb, if you can, buy at least 3 months worth of hay at a time and have it tested. It's an inexpensive process. For less than $30. You can get that information back and know exactly what you're dealing with from a nutritional standpoint. And your typical grass hays, they might range between 8 to 12% crude protein. So when you think about the volume of hay that you feed to that horse, that ends up being more than adequate for most horses. And then if you're adding alfalfa on top of that, which is even higher in protein. So alfalfa might test, say 17 to 21 or 22% protein. So if let's say you're feeding a 50-50 mix, you can easily oversupply the horse's protein content just with the forage. Now, as far as fats go, generally when we're trying to pull more fat into the diet, you mentioned the person who asked the question mentioned oils. And the reason that we rely on oils so heavily is because they are so dense. So an oil is essentially 99% fat. I mean, it's almost pure fat. And so it doesn't take much of an oil to have a pretty large impact. But there are other places that we can get fat. Rice bran is a good source of fat. That's something that we'll often use in horse diets. And then flaxseed, which we've already talked a decent amount about. Flaxseed is a really good source of fat in the horse's diet. So, rarely do I go seek out additional protein sources. So I generally don't seek out, say, a strict protein supplement for horses, unless I've got a horse that's on a very low quality grass hay. Now, trust me, I've seen plenty of grass hays out there that test, 4, 5, 6% crude protein. Those forages are going to need some help from somewhere. That's not going to provide enough protein for your horse. But there are definitely a variety of sources that you can go to get that protein and that fat together. And they're generally somewhat different.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do we have any?
Sorry.
Oh, we have a live in-person question.
No, it's good.
So I'm wondering, I've read that a horse that only has alfalfa really kind of needs something to balance that calcium phosphorus ratio, and that Bermuda hay is a good balancer for that to feed. I'm just wondering, is that the case? I mean, I'm getting my information online, and I just want to make sure that I'm following up. Right
so
now, I just have
I think what you're probably hearing it. So alfalfa is very high in calcium, it's low in phosphorus. So if you were to feed a diet that was really high in alfalfa, and then if you did not add an additional grain source or supplement that would provide phosphorus, you run into the chance of there not being enough phosphorus in the diet. So when we think about calcium and phosphorus, kind of the golden ratio or the standard ratio that you'll hear people talk about is a 2-to-1. So what that means is you need to have at least 2 parts calcium to every 1 part phosphorus in the diet. Now, notice that I didn't say maximum 2-to-1, I said at least 2-to-1. So that means, you're safe to have a 3-to-1, a 4-to-1, even a 5-to-1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus. Where you might run into trouble is, let's say you get all the way up to like a 12 or a 13-to-1, then that could get a little bit dangerous. One of the easiest ways to pull that calcium level back down in the diet is to cut the alfalfa. So just basically what you're doing is you're reducing the amount of alfalfa in the diet. Well, you still have to provide enough fiber in the diet, enough total bulk forage. So you just replace that with something like a Bermuda grass hay. Is a good option because a Bermuda grass hay is generally going to be lower in calcium. But the most important piece of all of that is making sure that you do have adequate levels of phosphorus in the diet to begin with. So that's most important. And then secondary is looking at that actual calcium amount. And there are situations where you may need to pull that back some.
Yeah, follow up.
If I can get a little bit more technical on that for the techies in the group, but it might help explain things a little bit. The way the body regulates calcium and phosphorus absorption and metabolism is calcium absorption is under the control of thyroid hormones. So when you look at, so another question is sometimes people say, well, can I do a blood calcium and know if my diet is adequate in calcium? No, you can't. The reason being is that regardless of what the dietary calcium level is, with the control of those thyroid hormones and the metabolic controls in the body, it's going to maintain a consistent calcium level in the blood. Okay, so you could have a calcium excess of the diet, you could have a calcium deficiency in the diet, but your blood calcium is going to stay fairly normal unless you've got some type of pathological issue going on, which is going to affect that. So now, just for discussion purposes, if you got a calcium deficient diet, then where's the calcium come from to maintain that blood calcium level? Altogether, the bones. Okay, so that's why a calcium deficient diet results in weak bones, which is a real bad thing for an athlete, especially an athletic horse. Now, there's no real set control on phosphorus, except that here's the thing to remember: phosphorus follows calcium. Okay, so if you've got you're feeding alfalfa, which is real high in calcium, but relatively speaking, low in phosphorus, okay, you've got a lot more calcium in the diet than what the body needs. So the body has a mechanism whereby it says, hey, I've got all, it says to the intestine, essentially, I've got all the calcium in here I need. I'm not bringing any more in. Okay, so it reduces calcium absorption. Well, as calcium absorption declines, phosphorus follows calcium. So phosphorus absorption declines. Now, what if you had a diet, and if you just looked at the numbers, your phosphorus intake, let's say you had a phosphorus requirement of 30 grams per day for this particular horse, and the diet provided 30 grams a day. So you say, oh, or let's just say even better, let's say provided 35 grams of phosphorus per day. So you would say, oh, well, I've got enough phosphorus to meet the requirement. But here's the kicker: your calcium level, your calcium phosphorus ratio is such that you got way more calcium than you do phosphorus. So you run into that situation where the body says, up, I got too much calcium, I'm going to reduce calcium absorption. Phosphorus absorption also drops. Okay, again, remember, phosphorus follows calcium. So even though you numerically had enough phosphorus in the diet, okay, now your body has reduced phosphorus absorption. So now he's not absorbing enough phosphorus, and you end up with a phosphorus deficiency. And that's why we refer to that as a secondary phosphorus deficiency, or secondary hyperparathyroidism is the technical term for that. Okay, that's why that cal-phos ratio is so important. And as Dr. Nichols correctly described, keeping, if you've got a high calcium alfalfa, you blend that with Bermuda grass, for example. It's not that the Bermuda grass is going to provide the phosphorus. What it's going to do is bring your cal-phos ratio closer together. And then your body's still going to absorb enough phosphorus in lieu of the calcium that's in the diet. Okay, so
We
a
had
little bit more
follow-up.
technical, but hopefully that explains it for some folks. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a follow-up, I believe, on that question.
I think she had a little follow-up question about testing of hay for levels of phosphorus and calcium.
Yeah, it is a little follow-up. It's when you get your hay tested, it just does fiber, fat, and I mean, I haven't had my hay tested, so how
Okay,
much
yeah.
information does it give you? Will it give you a calcium and phosphorus information too?
Yeah, absolutely. So it will give you really as much as you want it to, as much as you want to pay to receive. So calcium and phosphorus is a pretty standard result that's reported back. So you will learn in a hay sample, you will learn the calorie content, you will learn calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, iron content. You can get copper, zinc, manganese levels. You can request selenium, molybdenum. So that's another mineral that can tie up things like copper. So it along with, the ADF and NDF, which are your fibers, or measurements of the types of fiber that are in your hay, that gives you an indicator as to how digestible that hay is, how well the horse is going to be able to utilize it. And then you can also get your carbohydrate packs. So your starch level along with your sugars broken out into your water soluble carbohydrates and your ethanol soluble carbohydrates. So there's quite a large amount of information that you can actually get back on your hay.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
So you were mentioning earlier about vitamins and minerals and something like a ration balancer. And my horses are on, a senior or complete feed, my thoroughbreds, that in essence, they eat enough of it, should cover those vitamin minerals, but I noticed they still weren't at the condition I wanted them. I had a younger horse on a ration balancer. I added that to their diet and they really bloomed with that. So can you just talk a little bit more about ration balance, or in addition to forage versus the vitamin mineral contents in like a complete or a senior feed supplementation for thoroughbreds?
Okay. You want to take that, Jimmy? You want me to take that one?
Yeah. So this is one of those I want more information kind of questions. Especially I guess so. I kind of want to learn a little bit more, maybe about the types of forage that you were feeding in that situation, how much of the senior feed you were feeding, what kind of senior feed. And the reason I would ask those kind of questions are, was the ration balancer that you were using, supplying additional amino acids, maybe there were shortages in the senior feed based on the feeding rates that were being used for the particular horses. So there's just a lot of kind of missing information that my brain's kind of swirling around wanting to ask. So in general terms, we usually don't think about using minerals or vitamins specifically to put weight on a horse. And so that's why my hesitation in all of this. It makes me think that there's maybe was something else going on that the diet balancer that you use then pulled into the diet that really was kind of the magic ticket for that horse. So I don't know, Dr. Bill, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Well, like Dr. Nichols, one quick question. Got a couple of thoughts, maybe a couple of comments. When you say your horses did better, was that from the standpoint that they gained weight, or their hair coat improved, their attitude improved? When you say they did better, can you give us more details on exactly how did they do better?
Absolutely. So they are on pasture. So they're on grass pretty much 24/7. They also get supplementation with alfalfa. My hay and my pastures and my alfalfa has been tested. So they were getting their minimum caloric, fat, protein content requirements to be in good weight. But some things we were seeing was a little bit of coat condition, a little bit of top line, or just that final kind of fill out. And when we put them on the ration balancer, which does have amino acids, we did see a significant improvement. So I just wanted maybe a little more understanding of that.
Okay. Couple of things could be going on there. But I guess let me throw this out for the general folks in terms of, supplementing with minerals and using ration balancers. If you're going to err from the standpoint of feeding more than what the horse actually needs versus feeding not enough, you're always better off to feed a little bit more than what the horse needs. The safety range on these mineral vitamin products, whether it's a balancer or a feed, is extremely wide. Okay, so you'd really have to overdo something big time before you got your horse into an excess or in a dangerous situation. So, you know, I threw that rule of thumb out. Okay, you'd 5 to 6 pounds of a complete feed in order to meet the mineral vitamin requirement. Okay, I'm feeding 7 pounds to my horse. His body condition is fine. He ought to be okay. But then I went ahead and threw in, you know, a balancer. I threw in, you know, a mineral vitamin supplement, and oh my goodness, his hair coat got better. His hoof quality got better. His attitude, top line got better. So what that horse just told you, though, is he actually needed a little bit extra. And this is an analogy I use that, you know, when you look at mineral vitamin requirements, Dr. Nichols mentioned the NRC, you know, the natural nutritional requirements for horses. Those are based on averages. Okay, the average horse requires that amount of zinc and that amount of manganese, et cetera. Well, if I happen to be standing with my right foot in a bucket of boiling water and my left foot in a bucket of ice cubes, on the average, I'm comfortable. Okay. So averages don't always work. Okay. So this is where you can actually, you know, if you're not sure that your horse is getting enough, if you think they could use a little extra bloom, maybe use a little extra top line, there's nothing wrong with throwing on, you know, a balancer or other type of supplement on top of that and see if your horse responds. And it sounds like in your case, your horse did respond. Now, the question is, okay, was it the additional minerals and vitamins? Was it the form possibly of, we haven't even talked about, like, you know, the vitamin E levels and the vitamin E sources that are on all the different feeds. But again, that's a discussion for another day. You know, chelated minerals versus non-chelated minerals, amino acid levels, amino acid balances. I mean, again, a lot of moving parts. But the fact that you added that product and your horses responded to it, you either satisfied what I call a borderline deficiency, or you provided a better balance of those nutrients, and your horses responded to it. So, okay.
Thank you so much. All right. I'm just going to ask a quick question because I brought something up earlier and didn't turn around and close it. I mentioned how my horse had surgery and it threw his gut out of balance. Can you explain why that would happen quickly for us, please?
Okay.
Sorry, I know it's a...
Yeah. In 10 words or less. Okay, here we go. Any type of stress is going to affect the microbiome. Okay. The microbiome has to be very diverse. In other words, many, many different kinds of bugs. The more diverse the microbiome, the healthier it is. Within reason, also the number of bacteria. Normally, the greater the bacteria, the better. But as you indicated, Stephanie, that you can go overboard. Okay, you can get an overgrowth, but it is more common to have a reduction in the number of bacteria and a reduction in the diversity. And when you get both of those happening at once, and surgery is guaranteed to do that. Okay, you're stressing the gut. One of the first things that gets hit is going to be the microbiome. And so just if nothing else happens, that reduction in diversity and the reduction in numbers of the good bacteria that are in the gut are going to affect the function of the gut, but then that opens the door for competitive bad bugs to come in and start to take control. Clostridia is a bug of opportunity. C. diff in particular. If that gets a hold of the small intestine, even if your horse isn't outwardly sick, it's certainly going to affect his feed utilization, his overall health and overall well-being. So anytime you've got heavy antibiotic usage, certainly anytime you've had a surgery, especially an intestinal surgery, you can take it to the bank that your horse's microbiome got blown out the window. Okay.
Thank you. If you want to learn more about the microbiome, just go to thehorse.com and use our search window for that. We've had several articles in the past year about it. It seems to be a growing research field. We also had a really cool story in the November issue that's just come out about the gut-brain axis and how the gut affects horses' behavior. It was a pretty interesting article. We are out of time today. Thank you so much, Dr. Nichols and Dr. Vandergrift, for your expertise and time and wisdom today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Okay.
Thank you for having us.
And we're so grateful to Triple Crown Nutrition for your sponsorship of this seminar. Thank you very much. We have a door prize to pull now. Oh, we got a few more tickets to throw in there.
Oh, good. Sorry.
Okay. Are you gonna let me do the honors?
Yes.
All right. Let's see. Joanne Walton. She won something good.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. Let's see who we have here. We have an H. Gorney. From Springport, Indiana.
Which would you like? Do you like the polo wraps or the treats?
Oh, let's do the treats. She chose the treats.
Okay, so we've got the polo wraps left.
One more. All right. We have a Diane Hansen.
Yes.
I wish you guys could see her excitement. All right. Thank you so much for coming today. Thanks again to the veterinarians, and I hope you guys have a good rest of the makeover.
All right. All right.
Bye, guys.